here is not just in telling you what virtue is, but in your becoming virtuous so that you can live a happier life. He goes on to describe a number of virtues to you in section 7 of book 2. I'm just going to walk through 4 of them to illustrate the sort of thing that Aristotle's talking about. The first virtue is just the same virtue we've been talking about all along. It's the virtue of bravery. Bravery will have 2 extremes. On one side you'll have cowardice, on the other side you'll have recklessness, and in the middle will be a range, which is bravery. And where you fall particularly in that range will be up to you. If you, for example, are a new soldier, as we saw earlier, then what might be brave for you to do in a dangerous situation might look a little closer to cowardice. You might not charge forward at the beginning of an advance, for example, but fall back and follow others. By the time you're a commander, however, or a skilled warrior in the prime of your fighting years, what is brave for you would be to lead the charge when it was time. When Aristotle talks about virtues, he talks about them in a much broader way than we normally think of virtues. We might think of virtues as bravery or generosity, but I don't think many of you have probably thought of virtues of anger or the virtue of wit. So let's begin with anger. Anger will also be a virtue Aristotle sometimes says is called mildness, that falls between 2 extremes. The extreme of deficiency will be someone who's apathetic. They don't get angry at things they should be angry at. If someone were to simply slap me across the face as I walk through a market, and my reaction would just simply be, oh, well, that's not appropriate, I should be upset. People shouldn't be hitting me in the market. On the other hand, rage would be the extreme excess, where instead of simply defending myself if someone slapped me in the market and calling them on it, might be the extreme of rage might be if I took my umbrella and beat them with it until they were senseless. That wouldn't be appropriate. It would be an excess amount of rage. Anger as a mean is going to fall between the 2 extremes, but closer to the side of deficiency than the side of rage. And again, where you fall depends partly on you and your particular situation. If you're a therapist, for example, it won't do to become angry at your clients for simply doing things that you know they do. It won't be useful, it won't be helpful to your clients if you yell at them angrily for doing what they're doing. If, on the other hand, you work as a pro bono defense attorney for the disenfranchised, and you can't summon up indignation at the way that they're treated, the kind of indignation that would cause you to speak eloquently and defend them in the courts and get them off if they're innocent, then you shouldn't be a defense attorney. Truth-telling is another interesting virtue because it's so easy to just think of it as truth on the one hand and lying on the other. But Aristotle wants to say it's not quite so simple as that. Instead, we need to think of truth-telling as a mean between the extreme of deficiency, where you lie, you simply don't speak the truth, and the other extreme, which doesn't have a good name perhaps, but we could think of it as being blunt or overly honest, where if someone says, "What do you think about my new girlfriend?" you say, "I believe she's the most annoying person I've ever met," instead of saying nothing at all. Or instead of saying something that's true, but is also a little kinder. So truth-telling as well can be a mean between extremes, and our job is to try to find out where we are now on the spectrum and move ourselves into the right spot for us between the two extremes. Finally, the last virtue that I want to talk about is the virtue of wit. That's right, Aristotle believes that there will be a virtue of party going, where you have on the one hand the boor, the person who when you take him to a party just stands there and refuses to have a good time. If someone comes to talk to them, he simply turns his back and makes everyone a little more miserable at the party. That's the extreme of deficiency, but there's an extreme of excess as well. If you're a buffoon, then you need to have all the attention and become the life of the party. But that doesn't let anyone else have their time to shine or to tell their stories or to share what they've brought. And so wit is also a virtue that's very helpful for life, even today when we're all Zooming each other rather than meeting face to face. You'll notice there are certain people who talk more than other people. In fact, they might even talk over other people during the Zoom calls, and that makes it very difficult to hear from the shyer people. And so everyone needs to regulate themselves, even in social situations like Zoom calls and Hangouts. The last thing I need to show you, our discussion of virtue ethics a la Aristotle, is how do we reach the mean? And here Aristotle has some very helpful tips that you can find in Book 2, Section 9. First, he says, some means will always be a little closer to one extreme than to the other. As, for example, with bravery, when the mean in general will look a little more like recklessness than cowardice, and anger, where there the whole mean will look a little more like apathy than it will like rage. So, first piece of advice that Aristotle gives you is to shoot away from the opposed mean. Shoot away from rage if you're working on anger. Shoot away from cowardice if you're working on bravery. The second piece of advice that Aristotle gives you is that you yourself may be more inclined to one side than the other, in which case you need to overcompensate toward the side that you don't tend to yourself. If I know that I tend to make coffee a little stronger than most people like it, then I'm going to try to put fewer grounds in the pot in order to try to make the right mixture of the coffee, or if you're working towards being witty and you tend to be very shy, you should try to act a little more like you think a buffoon might, and you might surprise yourself by hitting the mean. Finally, pleasure and pain are very important in virtue. Aristotle says that if we pay attention to what gives us pleasure and pain, we can, on the one hand, reward ourselves when we're working for virtue. So we associate that with pleasant things like giving yourself an ice cream sundae when you finish studying about Aristotle, or you can use the fact that you still feel pain when you try to get up in the morning without hitting your snooze 4 times. That pain will tell you that you have not yet achieved the virtue of temperance. At the end of the day, then, we've seen that Aristotle thinks that there are 2 kinds of reasoning, one theoretical, one practical. Reasoning well about theoretical things will give us virtues of thought. Reasoning well about practical matters will give us virtues of character. And virtues of character are what we've been defining and discussing this evening. I hope that you find the results as pleasant as I have. Until next week, bon appetit with virtue!
The Pandemic Professor is made possible by the tolerance of the other 2 people that share the 1-bedroom apartment with Professor Van Dyke.